Great. Wonderful. Thank you, Daita. It's really great to be here with you all. My name is Katie Williamson. I'll share a bit more about myself and where I come from, but it's really, really nice to be here, joining you all from RARE, an organization based in Arlington, Virginia. So that's where I'm calling from today. And let me see, I'm just going to get us started as we dive in. Big thank you to ASHE for including this in their workshop series for you all, and excited to spend the next few hours together talking a lot about behavior change. So what are we going to be up to today? Hopefully you saw Daita's email about just the high-level agenda or objectives, but just so we are all on the same page, here's what I'm hoping to share with you all. So really talking about the steps of behavior-centered design, and I'll go into more detail about what that is and what it looks like in a little bit, but that's going to be a framework we're going to be using today. We're also going to be talking about just what it looks like to use a behavioral lens to think through environmental challenges and problem solving. We're going to talk about the 6 levers of behavior change, and also understand the importance of incorporating behavior change into your theory of change. So I think some of you may be interested in evaluation or measuring behavior change, and hoping to talk about that a bit today. And also just give you some experience with hands-on tools and practice opportunities for your own behavior change and environmental work. So hopefully that will give us a great foundation on a lot of this. And we only do have a few hours together, so we won't be able to go into a ton of depth on each component, but hopefully we'll give you some knowledge and some tools to come away with, and I'll share some future opportunities to continue learning if that's of interest. In terms of our agenda, so doing a quick welcome now, I'm going to talk about our behavioral lens, do an introduction to our framework of behavior-centered design, and then from there, we're going to start working with a case study. And I think some of you, hopefully this will be super relevant. We're going to work on a recycling or a waste related case study, and we'll walk through some of the steps of behavior-centered design. So we'll get a taste of what it looks like to do those. And some of the names, if they look unfamiliar here, like framing or prototyping or mapping, those are all different steps of the behavior-centered design process that we're going to walk through together. And then we'll close with talking about assessment and evaluation. I'm going to build in 2 breaks just because attention fatigue is a real thing with virtual engagements. And I know a lot of us spend a lot of time on our screens, depending even if you're back in person or not. So we'll have a few breaks as well in there. In terms of other just ways to participate, I'm going to be trying to keep an eye on the chat box. So please feel free to drop your questions and comments into there. I'll be sharing resources there as well. And Daita, I may ask for your help if you think I skip over anything, or I'll try to pause for questions at different points. But if there is anything that you see in there, feel free to let me know, and happy to jump in. I imagine many of us are familiar with Zoom, but if you would like to participate, just because we do have a lot of folks on the call today, which is wonderful, I encourage you to use that hand raise feature. So if you're in the bottom bar, you'll see that. I think it's where the kind of the emojis are. There's a place where you can raise your hand, and that's going to be a great way also for me to just see you as I'm looking at the different screens. You can also ask questions in the chat, but if you have something more immediate that you have, feel free to use that feature, and then I'll be able to call on you. So just a few notes there. Awesome. All right. So a little bit about me. So as I said, my name is Katie. I work at RARE, which is a behavior change and conservation organization based in the US, but does work internationally. My role is I am a manager of learning and tools. So I work a lot on creating behavior change resources, tools, and trainings for environmental practitioners, both within our organization and externally. My background is in environmental studies, anthropology, psychology or behavioral science, and education. So I'm a former member of the sustainability offices at Dartmouth College and the University of Michigan. So if there's anyone from those places on the call, special hello to all of you. I think someone actually messaged me in the chat about that, which is great. but have gotten to work with folks from a lot of different universities and other just educational institutions. So I'm excited to meet you all and get to know some of the challenges you're working on. Something else that's been a really fun initiative that we've done a couple times at RARE are what we call behavior-centered design challenges with university students, where we did one of our recent ones at Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, where we did a sprint of sorts on solving a behavior change challenge together around increasing plant-rich diets, or students who are choosing plant-rich options in the dining hall. So some other just behavior change engagements within that education space. So looking forward to digging in a bit more with you all. A bit more about RARE, if you're unfamiliar with us, as I mentioned, we are an organization that's based in the US, but working mostly internationally. Our history is really within community-based, community-centered behavior change. That's been our specialty for about the 40 years that we've been around, or I guess close to 50 now, and working in a lot of different countries. Our core areas now are on overfishing, or sustainable fishing, climate-smart agriculture, and also household and individual behavior change in the US around climate change. And our Center for Behavior and the Environment, which is the department that I work in and my team, we're kind of the behavior change hub within the organization that supports our internal programs, as well as sharing behavior change insights and tools and trainings with other environmental practitioners. So we're really excited to be here with you all today. So with that, I'm going to start us off into our content for today with really this first question of developing a behavioral, or this behavior change lens. So there's a lot of different problem-solving lenses that we can use when we solve problems, and we're going to really focus on what it looks like to think about our problems through this behavioral lens. So these are some questions that I've heard in some form from folks working on universities or with students or other academic institutions. So about creating engaging messaging, engaging decision makers, supporting students and student clubs, making green behaviors easier, reaching students who may be less engaged, and then getting the campus community to do something correctly. So sometimes even if you get a lot of people say recycling, still people are not sorting correctly, or there's something even more specific that you'd like something to do. So I'm sure there are many more questions, but hopefully one of these may resonate with you. And if so, these are all questions that are really great for looking at through a behavior change lens. So these are some lenses we often see a lot of practitioners using when they come to problems, and they're all really great and contribute their own perspective. So oftentimes we're looking at things with an ecological or an environmental lens. So looking at the connections within ecosystems, we see this a lot with our conservationists. In terms of how just understanding either wildlife or just the flows within environmental systems. We also have a systems thinking lens, which has become, I think, increasingly popular, of looking at all of the different feedback loops and relationships within systems, particularly sociopolitical systems, and how those contribute to environmental problems and solutions. And then we have our behavioral lens. And this is really where we're identifying, where does human behavior contribute to environmental problems and solutions? And all of these lenses can be really valuable. We're going to mostly focus on that behavioral lens today, but I think there's absolutely ways to bring in lots of disciplines to this process, and encourage you to bring that if that's an area of expertise for you. And one more thing I want to add is about this definition of behavior. So this is a really common word that we probably use all the time. And there's a lot of related variables too that get connected to behavior. So just so we're all using this in the same way for the purpose of this workshop, we're going to define behavior today as something that you do. So it's an action that you are taking. And this is connected to these other really important variables or concepts, such as beliefs. So that's what you know or accept to be true. So I'm using a recycling example here of maybe believing that recycling is important. or attitudes, which is what you think is good or bad. It's more of a general assessment of something. Your intentions, which is probably the most strongly correlated with behavior of what you plan or intend to do. And then we've also just got this behavioral context. So what is the larger environment in which the behavior is happening? So that's also an important thing. So we can talk about all of these different things together when we talk about behavior and behavior change. And some of these concepts are going to be really important again when we talk about theories of change at the end of our session today. But one of the main takeaways I want to share now is just the importance of when we talk about really measuring behavior, we're really talking about actions. And those beliefs and attitudes and intention and context are really important, but really making sure that if we're trying to achieve a behavior change impact in our community or our campus or our organization, we're really trying to identify what are those specific actions that people are doing. And this is a quote we really love from Catherine Wilkinson, who may be familiar to many of you. She's been really involved in the Drawdown Project, also just released a book recently. And she has this great quote around just awareness is a place that we can really get stuck. So it's how do we help kind of go from really wanting people to care or to know more about issues to actually taking action. And that's something that a behavioral lens is really well positioned to do, is help us kind of make that connection. Some of you may have heard of this concept of the intention action gap, which is where everyone wants to do something, or there is this feeling, there's a lot of care and energy around something, but we haven't quite translated that into actual action. So how do we do that? And that's where we can use a lot of these behavior change tools. So we're going to just do a quick practice, given I'm in with a lot of educators or folks who work in educational institutions, lots of place for hoping to build in a lot of ways for us to apply our different skills throughout the session today. So I'm going to put up these statements, and I'd like you to identify whether it's a belief or attitude. Those are one concept together: intention, behavior, or context. And so feel free to share that in the chat. There's going to be, I think, 4 of these. And just share what you think it is, and we'll just go through these to just see that we're distinguishing them correctly. Okay, great. I'm seeing a lot of intentions coming through here. Beliefs, context, tension. Great. Perfect. So this one is going to be an intention. So the key part here is the plans to. So we want to start a composting program, but we haven't actually identified that behavior of our campus. We started a composting program, or we are composting. So the intentions are often, as I said, really tightly correlated. But in terms of things you might want to measure, if your administration, for instance, says, oh, we're planning to do this by this date, that might be a really great thing to track on the path to them actually implementing the program, but is not quite the same as us measuring that change in behavior. How about this one? So reducing plastic waste is the right thing to do. Seeing a lot of beliefs coming in. Great. Beliefs and attitudes. All right, wonderful. Yes, so you all are right, totally correct here. So I put beliefs and attitudes together. You'll often see these concepts talked about similarly. Even though they do have a slightly different definition, but for the purposes of today, we can think of them as those psychological states or things that people believe or think are true, or positive or negative feelings about something. So this is something, again, we might want to be measuring if we were thinking about a larger behavior around plastic waste. And I'm seeing a question in here about beliefs being less changeable than an attitude. Yes, I think that's a good question. So there are, I would say that attitudes are more changeable, beliefs are a little more strongly held, and then values tend to be the most strongly held in terms of they're harder to change. So if you think about that in your own life, in terms of your attitude about a concept may change, maybe more subject to change based on something you learned or heard, where beliefs might take a little bit more effort for you to be convinced, and values even more so. Great. Great, good question. How about this one? What do you think this is? Yeah, getting a few different things for this one. I'm seeing context, I'm seeing intention, I'm seeing behavior. Great. So yeah, a lot of good ideas here. I think you could probably argue different things for this answer. I had context in mind for this one, and that thinking about the environment of being on a campus where there is this goal in mind, that there's this framework that's been put in place may make it easier for you to do a particular behavior change campaign or set of goals. And yes, Tina, I think that's a good point as well. You could have actually a behavior change campaign that leads up to publishing a report. So there could be a case where that's actually true. But in many cases, this may be a larger context for what's going on. And this is our last one. So this class of first-year students reduced their meat consumption. What is this one? Great. This one looks like it was an easy one for everybody. Behavior. Great. Yes, so absolutely. This one just really clear around this behavior change goal or target behavior that we're looking at. Excellent. So nice job with those. Just some definitions, and we're going to use these terms a lot in the session today. So good to just have those in mind. So I'm going to transition us into talking more about behavior-centered design and what is this framework and how do we use it. So we really like to talk about behavior-centered design is this blend of behavioral science and design thinking. And some of you may be familiar with more of one than the other, but we really love this combination because design thinking has all of this amazing ability to really center particularly humans and people in its designs of all sorts of problems, and has a really creative set of steps to do so. And then behavioral science brings in all of this rich knowledge about decision making and what drives people to do certain actions. And so we really layer them together in this framework through a series of steps. So this is our behavior-centered design journey, as we call it. There are 8 steps. It looks maybe somewhat linear, but it is a pretty non-linear process in that you may go back to previous steps. You may do steps more than once. And we like to have this because I think it is helpful to have some sort of sequence to go through as you're designing your campaign or solution, but it is in no means completely linear. I'm going to share a little bit just about what each of these steps means before we start practicing what this looks like. So in our frame step, this is really where we are identifying core actors, the target behavior, and the larger context. So like we were just doing in our past exercise, really trying to figure out and narrow down what is the behavior and who is also the actor that's connected to that behavior and that environment we're working in. Empathize is really about understanding the core actors or audience's behavioral motivations and challenges. So why is someone doing a certain behavior now, and why are they not maybe doing the behavior that we would ideally like them to do? Map is where we're making connections between the data and behavioral science. So this is where we start to write hypotheses about what we think we need to change to create that behavior change that we're looking at. Ideate is where we generate and prioritize solution ideas. And the next few steps are really informed from design thinking. So if any of you are familiar with that, these step names may look familiar, but ideate is just another word for brainstorming. You'll see there's a pause hand here, and that is just to recommend that you really check that you have all the data that you need before really going into the solution part of this process. From there, we go into prototype, which is where we build a small version or a draft of the one solution that we've chosen that we then test with the actors of the community in which we're hoping to see a change. And then once we see signs of success, we actually plan and launch our full-scale intervention and then assess and monitor that behavior adoption, which hopefully has occurred based on the solution we came up with. So those are the 8 steps. We're going to go through some of them today. We're going to really focus on the first 4 as well as assess, but I'll share just a couple other tips for prototype test and launch as well. We also really like to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. How are we creating an inclusive and equitable process as we go through these steps? So some examples of what this might look like are inviting people to really participate in framing the problem, really having that be a super inclusive solution and design process. Considering what are those enabling conditions or larger factors that might create or provide a barrier to change. Really asking whose perspective is not captured in this solution. Conducting research with a really diverse set of people, supporting people's choices and agency. So that's something we always want to be mindful of, particularly using behavioral science, is that we are influenced by a lot of the same things, and we want to make sure that we're doing that in a really ethical and supportive way. And also really using our data to design solutions, not our assumptions. And this is a really hard one, particularly when we have observed certain behaviors or patterns for a really long time, and we think we've really got it figured out. It can be tempting, even when we do research, to really rely on what we think we know about a behavior. And so trying to really use the data that we find as much as possible. So that's just an overview of behavior-centered design, and we are going to now go into the first step of framing the challenge. I will pause quickly in case there are any just quick questions about behavior-centered design. Feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat before I keep going.
I guess I have a question, Katie.
Sure.
So how does this framework differ from community-based social marketing, or are they very similar? Because I guess, yeah, I see some parallels. Are sort of the same animal, if you will? If you could just speak to that, I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So community-based social marketing, I think there's, I think I think I've already seen this somewhat in the behavior change space. Is there's a lot of different names for a lot of similar concepts, and you'll see that as well when I go through the levers of behavior change. That some of those concepts you've probably seen having different names in other places. I would say one of the biggest differences about community-based social marketing is I think it evolved from using marketing principles for social impact. So I think the history of particularly social marketing really comes out of that, but it uses a lot of similar insights around like consumer research and insights, and developing a solution based on what you learn. I think what's a little different about this framework is some of the other in-between steps. So I think some of the tools that we use, say in framing, I think the focus on I think a lot of the design thinking components aren't necessarily represented the same way in community-based social marketing. I think you can still develop a lot of similar outcomes using both. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's not really one is better than the other. I think they just are slightly different ways. But I think they both use a lot of behavior change principles. I think in some ways it may be more just the history or the lens is there's more of a marketing focus. There's also more in the solution space. There tends to be more about messaging and thinking about some of the social marketing principles around identifying like place and product and delivery and thinking really strategically about messaging in a way that this framework really it allows for messaging campaigns, but also creates a much wider set of potential behavioral solutions. Hopefully that's helpful. Awesome, great.
Thank you.
Sure, and Krista, I see you have your hand raised as well.
Yeah, thanks. I had a clarifying question. You said behaviors connected to beliefs, attitudes, intentions, and contexts. What about behavior connection to one's identity, or I guess in a larger context, those norms? So recycling, from your example, you might believe it's good and think it's a great thing, and you would do it. But you don't see yourself as a recycler or one of those people, because you're not around those people and they're not the norms in your area. How does that fit in with the things that you had outlined as what behavior is connected to? Because I see that a lot, especially working in higher ed and with undergrads, that their identity is very important to shape their behavior.
Absolutely, that's a great question. So I'm using belief pretty generally in this context. And when I get to the section on levers of behavior change, hopefully you'll see some of that reflected in terms of emotional appeals and social influences are two of the big levers that we see for behavior change, which really do connect to identity and those social norms. And so when I say belief and attitude, we can have beliefs. A lot of times those social norms are actually beliefs that we have about other people, for instance, or beliefs that we have about ourselves or what's important to us. So hopefully that helps. But yes, those are absolutely captured in the way that we think about this framework. Great. So, and Cassie, I see your question as well in the chat. Around assuming you already have the data you need. So I would say that it's possible you may already have some data when you start this process. You may also start this process in a different place. So you may start this process at Empathize saying, I actually, I've done all these surveys and interviews that I need. But if you're starting right at the beginning and going through the steps, the Empathize step is really about also collecting that data. So doing the actual interviews or the surveys or other things that you need. That helps. Great. Okay. So as we dive into the frame step, we're going to be using a case study also for a few steps in the practicing BCD today. We're going to be focusing on campus waste. And I chose this challenge because I had a feeling it might be relevant to many of you, and also is a really just tangible challenge that we can work on. So we're going to start this frame step and just get a taste of it by identifying the core actors, the behavior, and the context surrounding this. So there's a few different tools that we can use for this, and there are more even beyond the ones I'm going to mention here. We can do background research from folks who have studied this issue. We can do a problem behavior actor map, which is something we're going to practice in a moment. We can also do some stakeholder and actor mapping, so starting to map out what is the relationship between different actors. We can also do observation, just getting a sense of walking around, particularly on a campus environment, just seeing what's going on, getting a sense of what this behavior looks like. Some key principles here are really identifying the who and the what of behavior change, defining that action, recognizing that behaviors operate within larger systems, and also remembering that beliefs, attitudes, and intentions are not the same as behaviors, even though they are oftentimes correlated. For diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're often thinking about power dynamics in this space, or who do we think is, which actor group is either the most responsible or able for us to change, and then thinking about that as we select the focus. So this is an example of a problem behavior actor map, and I have one here for ocean plastic pollution. And this tool works by having us systematically think about identifying the environmental problem, asking who is contributing or who is connected to that problem, what are they doing or not doing now? So what is their current behavior? And then what do we want them to do? So what is the target behavior? And by doing this, it can help us identify where some of those shifts need to happen while still really focusing on this point of identifying behaviors. So we're going to do a quick exercise together, all together. And so I'm actually going to share screen with an interactive version of this. And I would love just kind of popcorn style. So you can either, again, raise your hand or drop in the chat. Figuring out what would you add to this problem behavior actor map, recognizing that we're in different contexts, but just for us to practice brainstorming, what might this look like? So I am going to share, let's see if I can grab my mural here. Okay, simulator exercise. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see this screen that I have up. And so I have the same problem behavior actor map. I just put it into this interactive format so that I can type. And would welcome your thoughts. Either, again, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat box about what, maybe we'll start with some actors. What are some actors that you would contribute, that you would put on this map in terms of the amount of campus waste going to landfill? So I'm seeing students, I'm seeing athletics. And I'm sure there are many visitors. Great. I'm seeing food halls. Right, I'm gonna try to keep up here with all of our things. Construction teams. Oh my goodness. Even more than I ever could have brainstormed. Okay, we'll do procurement. Do dining halls. Faculty, staff, and students, vendors. Facilities, cleaning staff. Okay. Do events. Ooh, yeah, there's a lot of different things here. Okay. Put there cleaning staff, construction. Okay, I'm going to do facilities. I'm going to add facilities. I recognize we may not get to all of them, but we can at least get a sense of, okay, there's a lot of different actors that are focused on this. So dining halls and food halls is the same. Let's do construction in there. Okay, so for each of these actors, so maybe we can just even pick a few to focus on here. So thinking about students, what are some current behaviors that the students are doing now? So I kind of put this one example here of like throwing away plastic bottles. What are some other things we can focus on for students? Online ordering. Oh, throwing away masks wherever they want. Okay. Items in the wrong bins. Yes. So great. Confused about where to put items. Yep. Contaminating. So yep, putting items in the wrong bins. Yep, move out. So leaving items behind. That's great. Waste, wish cycling. Oh, I want to learn about wish cycling. That's a new term. I don't think I know what that means. Food and recycled containers. I remember that was a big culprit when I was in college. So maybe recycling contaminated items. Getting wrong information about recycling. Great. Desire for flexibility, taking food and drink with them or off campus. Great. So for that one, Christina, so tell me more about what's the behavior there. They have a desire for flexibility, taking food or drink. What does that mean to you in terms of the behavior that you feel like is causing a problem? Oh, I like that.
I guess maybe I need to think about it a little bit more. Yeah, just like their desire for flexibility, either, meaning that the things that the campus has control over procuring doesn't necessarily, like, they can bring whatever they want to campus anyway. And then also they can take stuff from campus off campus. So they their movements are in flux, I guess. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have added that one. Sorry about
No,
that.
that's okay. No, I think it's great. I think I'm trying to figure out if it's more of a motivation or barrier or whether it's more of a behavior. Because sometimes we think about them together. And so for this exercise, I'm trying to get us to think about just those behaviors. I think I was hearing a little bit in there, you were saying that, for instance, if there was certain, like if everything on campus was compostable and they go somewhere that has, say, plasticware, they can bring it onto campus. So there's just the kind of not just using things that go beyond the campus provided items. Let's see, maybe materials or waste. Okay, great. Stuffing their stuff in a bag rather than sorting. Yep. Okay, so maybe, all right, so we'll maybe stop there. So let's brainstorm. So we're just going to pick this one actor just because we can see there's a lot going on for students here. So what are some target behaviors? So thinking about some of the ones that you see on this screen in terms of putting items in the wrong bins, what are some, let's flip that and think about what do you want students to do? Great. So remember water bottles, mugs, great. Reuse things. Great. So refilling water bottles, donating items, using the right bins, signage. That's a good one. Awesome. Recycle right, think before you buy. Yeah, so these are some great ones. Before you buy. Awesome. Model and encourage behavior. Awesome. This is great. So this exercise I wanted to demonstrate just so we can see what one actor might look like. In terms of identifying those behaviors. So we could imagine that we do this for athletics, we do it for visitors, we do it for construction. This may even tell me that I need to even further narrow this problem. I might need to think, okay, amount of campus waste going to landfill from dining halls. And then that might help me even further refine what the actors are and the behaviors that I might be focused on. But we can see this would be a pretty enormous problem behavior actor map that we might be focused on. And can help us identify where we want to focus. So from here, what we might do is identify, okay, we're going to focus on students. We're going to focus on this particular issue of maybe not sorting or contaminating items, and then the very particular behavior related to that we want them to do. So we want them to sort their recyclables, or we want them to use their own water bottles. So this can help us just map out what that problem looks like, and also focus on a particular behavior and actor that we want to focus on. So any questions just about this tool? This is something I can share a link. So we have a worksheet to this tool that if you're interested in doing this for your own problem, I can share that. So after the time today, if you want to dig into this a bit more, you're welcome to. But just so we get a taste of what this looks like. How do you know when to stop mapping? Yes, that is a good question. I think I think this is a great step to do with other people in terms of just when you kind of run out of ideas. I think that's a good place to, I mean, even in 2 minutes, we brainstormed a ton of different things that you could put on this page. I think it also may be something, as I said, this is nonlinear. You may go do some research and find out, oh, there's this whole other actor group I forgot about that you could go and add back to your map. But I would say, if you have a group of people that have different perspectives on the topic and you work on this for a little while, you may also, through the process, just start to already gravitate towards a particular behavior actor. We oftentimes, in that tool that I mentioned, there's a series of questions that we ask in terms of, where do you have momentum to focus? Where do you have the resources? Do you already have existing relationships with these actors? And so that can be another thing to maybe ask yourself, that if you've brainstormed a bunch of actors that you don't have access to, it may be worth continuing. A few thoughts there. Okay, go back to our slides here. Oh, Anne, I see you have a question as well.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm a little bit sick. I'm just not going to put my camera on real quick.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if this map can be done, and this behavior analysis can be done, maybe not at an individual level, but at like an organizational culture level.
Tell me more about what you are.
So, like, are you assessing individual behaviors, or are you assessing cultural behaviors of an organization? So how can you do both, or is it specific to, kind of how people behave individually or generally, or is it kind of like, well, this department does this, or, our institution behaves this way?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think it'll somewhat depend on the problem. I think you're right that there are going to be certain groups. This is where I think identifying what are somewhat, I guess, homogenous sets of actors, if that makes sense. So at like a university, I don't know if you'd want to separate like the president from, the facilities manager from like the individuals. I think you could probably do like the whole administration or the whole chemistry department. If you feel like there are going to be meaningful differences between those groups, I think you could put them in that way. I think this tool does encourage you to work at different levels of the system. Like within I'd say a university environment, they're going to be different everywhere from students to faculty to the administration, facilities. I think those are all different groups that you can map, given that they are all doing a particular behavior. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm gonna move us into our next step. I know this we'll just get a little bit of exposure to each one, but just so you can get a taste for it. So I'm gonna bring us into empathize. And this is a step where we are really understanding our actors' behavioral motivations, barriers, context. So doing that actual research to learn more about our behavior. So this is also where we have a lot of different tools at our disposal. So surveys, interviews, focus groups. There's a tool that we sometimes use called participant photography, where you give people cameras to really capture their everyday experience. It's kind of an ethnographic tool, and as well as observation. And there are many, many others as well. Principles here are really understanding people in and on their own terms, and really recognizing what are your own potential biases or assumptions, so that you can be more curious and open-minded during this process. Some DEI considerations, so just being thoughtful about how we're collecting and storing our data, understanding our own position and identity during research, and really engaging in that deep and active listening. So being open to being surprised or having our assumptions challenged is really, really important. So I'm going to, as a way of really getting us to think about different types of motivations and barriers, I'm going to share about our levers of behavior change framework. And this is really how we start to categorize and think about those motivations and barriers, and also come up with solutions that we actually use in our behavior change solutions. So this is going to be a brief overview of that framework and some examples, particularly in university settings of where those come about. So before we get to the levers, just a quick overview of some framing about behavioral science and decision making. So there's a lot of different things going on when we are making decisions of all kinds. So sometimes we are really weighing our options, calculating costs and benefits. Sometimes we are reacting more automatically or quickly, and there's this whole spectrum. And sometimes it's this combination of both. So the behavior levers framework really recognizes that we make a lot of different types of decisions. And we need tools that are going to account for all of that. Even along the spectrum, though, we often assume and like to think that our decisions are mostly made in this very deliberate, calculating mode, because we think we are very rational and logical beings. And this is sometimes true. And when we think that this is how we make a lot of our decisions, we often tend to gravitate towards these types of strategies, which are information, material incentives, and rules and regulations. And I'm not going to go into too much depth on these because I'm assuming they are largely familiar to all of us. But the way that we think about these three levers are material incentives are really how we are increasing or decreasing costs, time, or effort. So how are we making things easier, harder? Are we giving rewards or penalties for doing something? Rules and regulations are really the rules or laws or sometimes bans that are put into place around a behavior. And then information is really providing some different types of information. So maybe what the behavior is, why it's important, how to do it. So maybe that step-by-step instruction or building awareness around a particular behavior. And so some examples, just to make this really concrete, of what you might have seen. So I'm sure all of us have seen these in the last few years, but requirements around wearing masks. So this is a really good example of rules and regulations. What's also really interesting about this one is that sometimes these come with a consequence and sometimes they don't. And oftentimes they are more effective when there is a consequence in place. So if you, for instance, go into a grocery store and you need to wear a mask, and there is a strong rule with what we would call paired with a material incentive, that is, if you don't wear your mask, we are going to ask you to leave the store, there's a very strong consequence in place, and that can make the rule more effective. Where I know I've gone into stores where there is a mask requirement and a lot of people are not wearing masks. And then I start to wonder, how important or how effective is this rule that is in place in terms of causing me to put on my mask when I enter the store? So it's an interesting way, and some rules, depending on the context, sometimes just the presence of a rule or a requirement can cause people to change their behavior. So upon seeing this sign, they might put on their mask. Other people might say, well, if nobody tells me to do anything different, I'm going to try to go in without my mask and see if anyone tells me to leave. So just there are different ways that we interact with those rules, which is sometimes helpful to think about. This is an example of information. I imagine many of you who are working on campuses may have similar graphics like this, where there's just a lot of information, trying to be very clear about what you can and cannot put in certain bins, particularly when it comes to waste streams. This is an example from Dickinson. One thing I also wanted to mention just on information is that sometimes we'll talk about information as if it's all the same. And information is really important to us as a species. We love to learn and we're drawn towards it. But I wanted to point out a couple different types of information that can help us be even more specific when we draw on this lever. So there's some terms here. So declarative knowledge is really our knowledge about how things work, and really answers what is it. So in the case of, say, composting, it might be, what is composting? Like I've never heard of this before. What is that term? What does it mean? And so kind of reducing the uncertainty around that. Effectiveness knowledge is more about the impact a behavior has on the problem. So some people might be like, okay, well, I know what composting is, but what impact does it have on soil health or on supporting local gardens or organizations? And then the last one here is procedural knowledge. This is the how-to knowledge. So if I know what composting is and I know why it matters, but I don't actually know how to do it. I don't know how to start a compost pile or what the ratio is. And so that's a different type of knowledge that's helpful. The one that's not on here that I think is a fourth that I'll add is more around self-efficacy. So that's the belief of, do I actually have the skills to compost? Do I know, do I feel confident in my own ability to do the behavior? And that can also be really important. So a takeaway here being that when we talk about information, it can be really helpful to think about what type of information actually is a barrier towards that. Okay. So with these three levers that I've shared so far, oftentimes we find that they don't work on their own, even though they may be some default strategies that we go towards. So with incentives, they can sometimes backfire on us. They can what we call crowd out other motivations. So we see this a lot with, say, volunteering behaviors, where if we try to, say, pay someone or offer a reward or an incentive for volunteering, it can make people feel less good about their motivation to volunteer. So incentives can be a little tricky in that way. They can also just drain resources. If we have a budget for a program, incentives can quickly run out. And for more resourced individuals, they can just be seen as the cost for the behavior. And so that can actually not really be a barrier at all. For rules, as we talked about with the mask example, they oftentimes work well with enforcement. And in certain contexts, if the rules are not trusted or credible, then they may not carry much weight. So that's something that we can learn a lot in just understanding the environment in which we're working. And then finally, with information, we've found that correcting kind of this information deficit usually does not lead to lasting behavior change. Usually we need some other lever in combination with information. And caring and knowing is not a prerequisite to change, which can be really hard to believe, particularly with something. I think I've seen this a lot with students who care so passionately about the environment and want other students to care. And sometimes, finding other routes to change behavior other than trying to convince other students to care as much as they do can be really helpful. So in addition to these levers, we have three others that I want to share some examples on. And those are emotional appeals, social influences, and choice architecture. And these ones we're adding to the other three to really round out our full levers. And these are all these categories of intervention strategies that we use. And we can use them in combination or individually, but I recommend using them in combination because I think they tend to go better just because we have so many different types of motivations for a given challenge. So we'll walk through these and a few examples. So emotional appeals, this one is really just about how a lot of our decisions are emotional, and we have either a connection to our identities or our values. That really drives how we feel about something or how we choose to act. And there's some really interesting research on how different emotions cause us to act in different ways. So what pride causes us to do, or what anger causes us to do, and also just how we react to something that connects to us. So I had to bring up a mascot example, particularly for many of us working in academic environments. And this connects to a study that was really interesting at the University of Delaware. You'll also see the rare mascot, because that's something we've used a lot in our campaigns around the world. And they did an experiment at Delaware where they were looking at the impact of mascots on student behavior, particularly when it came to this environmental kind of hypothetical case study. So these groups of students were assigned to either work with this rare mascot or the University of Delaware mascot in this, it was like a kind of a pollution case study that they were doing in a class. And the mascots would express different emotions when students made different decisions, particularly around deciding to pollute or not pollute and protect the water source. And what was really interesting about this study, other than that the mascots were more effective than the groups that didn't have mascots. But what was really interesting is that groups were nearly 75% more likely to reach this clean water goal, so pollute less, when the mascot was the University of Delaware mascot. And really just speaks to the importance of that personal connection and identity for the Delaware students. And so we can broaden this just to think about when we do messaging. This also relates to social marketing. So thinking about just when we make things really appeal to what people care about, it can really help to enhance our message. This is another really interesting study that is not environmental, but was I think a great example, particularly as we are really kind of in the middle of flu season. So this is from the University of Pennsylvania, and they were trying to increase flu vaccination rates and looking at different messages to encourage people to really go to their appointments and then get appointments to get vaccinated. So the researchers found they were playing around with some different types of messages, and they found that changing the message from your vaccine is available for you to your vaccine is reserved or waiting for you made a big difference. So even that simple change in word led to an 11% increase in vaccinations across nearly 1 million patients nationwide. So a pretty big bump just in this one change in language. So a pretty powerful example of just making someone feel like that sense of ownership, or that sense of, oh, there's this, like someone's already reserved something for me, that's mine. The next lever that I want to talk about is social influences. So this is a big one. It's already come up a bit today, just on the power of social norms. And there's two different types of social influence that I want to talk about. So the first is what we can think about as reputational influence. So this is really us being affected by how people are perceiving us. So me as an individual, what do my friends think about me? What do my faculty or my family or my peers or classmates think about me? So it could include whether people can see my behavior, whether my behavior is visible to others, or what others think is right or wrong. And then the second type of influence can be called descriptive or normative influence. And this is really, I'm affected by what I see other people doing. So what is, say, cool or popular right now, or what I just see a lot of other people doing, and that must be the thing to do in this particular scenario. So it's just what is normal behavior. So if everybody is bringing their own mug to campus, maybe I'm more likely to see that and think that it's something that I should be doing too. So we tend to see that a lot of the social influences really fall into these two buckets. I'll give you a couple examples of this. Some of your campuses may participate in this. And this is a good example of social influences in terms of competitions. So we see these a lot at universities, and they both have a really good they do a good job of creating that group identity within either a dorm or university to university. And it really can boost motivation to compete with another group. And so that can be really helpful. It also is building norms about, oh, this group, recycled this much. So we should try to match that, or it's just a common practice. So it builds in a lot of different social normative influences here. So in 2020, Recyclemania was able to reduce, 40 million pounds of waste just through their programming. So just the power of competition. Competition is one of those tricky things that it tends to work well in those short time frames. And I think one of the major challenges I see with competition is just the ability to sustain that behavior after the competition has ended. So a really good competition is one that can actually build a durable habit and that norm. So I think those are the ones that I think do a really, really good job in their programming. One other example, and this is another one from Dickinson, but I know these programs are at a lot of different colleges and universities, is this program of eco-reps. So whether this is first-year students or other groups of students, cohorts that can act as champions or leaders among their peers, they model the behavior. I think I saw that in the chat come up earlier. So those trusted students who can really show what it looks like to, say, live environmentally or show those habits. They can also be really helpful for showing how to do something correctly, because people will look to them for guidance or advice. So another really good example of that. And then the last lever I want to talk about is choice architecture. And this is the one that's maybe the least familiar. For anyone who has heard of the term nudging, this is something that's really gained a lot of popularity in the last decade or so. And that kind of falls within this bucket of choice architecture. So how do we change the choice environment? And all of us experience this in a lot of different ways, whether it is, we can think of choice architecture kind of like a GPS, where it is giving us guidance or instructions about where to go. But we can also choose to do something else. We can take another path if we want. We see this a lot with things like defaults. So if you've ever been online, whether you're checking out online, and you'll see a checkbox already checked. That's an example of a default, where they're assuming that you will use something called status quo bias, which means you are unlikely to change away from what the status quo is. So you may not even notice the box is checked, and you're more likely to do what is ever is there. Or just the alerts or the timers that we set on our phones, anything like that grabs our attention is also an example of choice architecture. So these are these tools in our environment that we use to help us make different decisions. This is an example of this using defaults again. This is from Rutgers University, where the computer lab just changed the default setting on the printer to be double-sided instead of single-sided. And we're able to reduce paper use by 45%. So this very, very simple intervention that they were able to put that in place and led to this really big change in behavior around just double-sided printing, just maybe because students didn't know how to change the default, or it didn't really matter as much to them. Another example is these specially designed lids on these waste receptacles. So there's been some research done on this, that both changing the prominence of bins can really increase waste sorting and just also reduce littering. And also that the specialized lids just provide that cue or reminder to people of, I'm trying to put a bottle in this particular hole and it's not fitting. It requires a little bit of attention for someone just to notice and make that decision. So again, just trying to support that behavior in any way we can. So oftentimes we'll get this question of what is the difference between choice architecture and material incentives. So I just wanted to go over that really quickly in case anyone has had that question as I've been going through. And the major difference here is kind of the amount of cost or benefit. So for instance, with a material incentive, it's something that you would really feel as a major cost. So for instance, like a reward or the convenience of having to, say, walk across campus, versus it being, in your own building. Those kinds of things are going to be more of a material incentive, where choice architecture are going to be those small changes in your environment, like making something more visible or a default, or slightly more streamlined messaging. Those kinds of things are more choice architecture. So if you have a question about that, those are somehow we see the differences, and happy to give some more examples too, if that would be helpful. So I know that was a lot of content. So another way we're going to just practice this together. So I have a couple questions for you where you can practice figuring out what is the lever that is at work in these 3 different cases that I'm going to share. So there's going to be a 1-sentence case, and I'm going to give you 3 levers options, and you can put the number of it's 1, 2, or 3, and you can just put the number in the chat or name the lever. We're going to do that, and then we're going to take a quick break right after this. Okay, great. Okay, so people that received information about their neighbors' lower energy use led them to reduce their own energy. Okay, so I'm seeing social influences. All right, a lot of number 2s here. All right, great. Yes. So this one is social influences. So we're seeing that that visible change, that visible signal about what others are doing. So this is a real study that's been used a lot. There was a very famous study that came out by an energy company named Opower, where they had a little indicator on your energy report each month that showed what your similar neighbors were doing. That had an impact. How about this one? A campaign asking individuals to be a voter rather than to vote led to an increase in voter turnout. Information, emotional appeals, or social influences. Very nice. Seeing a lot of 2s coming in, 3 as well. Okay, great. A few 2s, a few 3s. Yes, so this one is really similar to the vaccination study that I shared, where that change in language. So this one is really about, this is also a real study that was done. Really just interesting change in language about signaling people's identity as a voter rather than asking them to vote led to that voter turnout. So we're really appealing to how people think about themselves and conceive of themselves. And then the last one here, so changing the placement and salience of plant-based items on menus increased people purchasing them. Another real world study that has been out there. Seeing a lot of 1s coming in. Great. All right. Yes, you are correct. This one is choice architecture. Yeah, just an example of how are we drawing attention to something in the way that we change even an informational environment like a menu to make something more obvious. So really nice job with those. We're going to take a couple minute break, so maybe like 2 minutes or so. So if you can come back at like 13 after, if you need to like grab some water, take a bio break. Just move and stretch your legs if that's available to you. And then we'll dive right back in. And feel free to just stay on audio if you're still moving about your space. So the next part of this is going to be designing a mini behavior change campaign. So I've shared a lot about, so we've done some framing of the challenge. We've talked a bit about the value of empathize and collecting data, and then also those levers of behavior change. And now we're going to use a real world case and spend a bit of time actually building and thinking through some ideas in groups. related to a case study. So some of you may have had a chance to look at this prior to the session. If not, no problem. I'm going to drop this into the chat. So this is the exact same thing that was in the email that Daita sent out, but just something you can open up in your web browser. So we're going to be working on, so sticking with our case of waste that we started the session with. So this one is just a very specific context for us to work with. So there's a study that was conducted in 2014 with several universities and colleges in Iowa. And the focus was really on student recycling habits, motivations, and barriers. And so I've taken just a subset of the findings from this study. There's a lot more to read in detail if you'd like. But just for today, because we have a shorter period of time, I think I've pulled out maybe 8 or so main findings in these different charts. And we're going to use that as our data to build our solution for the purposes of today. So we're going to go through the map and ideate steps. So we're going to do these in 2 different breakouts in groups where you're going to work with this data together. So in the map step is really where we're drawing those connections between our data and behavioral science and really developing a hypothesis. So oftentimes this involves analyzing our data, looking at who's currently doing the behavior or not doing the behavior, and trying to figure out what is motivating one, providing a barrier for the other. And this is a great chance for us to really lean into what we're seeing in the data rather than our assumptions, and really think about what is maybe the larger context that's affecting what's going on here. I know we have limited information about Iowa, so I recognize there will be some assumptions that we are bringing into the exercise today, but we'll try to use the data as much as possible. We also really like this step because it helps us really slow down getting to solutions. So that's something that we often find is that we have our data and then we immediately start coming up with solutions. We've figured it out. And the map step really encourages us to slow down and think about, okay, what are we seeing in the data? What do we think is going to actually cause a change? What do we need to change in order to cause that behavioral shift? So we're going to go into breakouts in about 1 minute, and we're going to spend about 20 minutes or so working on this. And there's 2 things I want you to do. I want you to look at the data set and identify what do you think are the major motivations or barriers for students to recycle. So I want you all to imagine for this time that you are working in, say, the sustainability office at Iowa, trying to just help design a program around this or some messaging. And so trying to figure out why do you think some students are recycling and others are not based on the data. And then when you figure that out, I want you to think about what do you think needs to change? So we're going to come back to those concepts of beliefs, attitudes, incentives, knowledge, thinking about the levers we just talked about. What do you think needs to change? So I've given some examples here that if we were noticing in the data that students are just too busy, they're only doing things that are convenient, they're not really looking at signage, like how might we make something more salient to them? How can we put something in their environment that that's going to be more obvious or convenient? So that might be something that we come up with. I don't think that's what the data says. So I don't think I'm giving you any solutions there. I think there's some other findings to dig into in the data. So I'm going to drop in the chat a worksheet for you to use. So this is a Google Doc. And when you open this, I think it's going to show you its view only. And so I encourage you to, as shown on the screen, go to File, make a copy. You can also download this if you'd like. It will open as a Word document. And use this in your group to answer the questions. So the same questions I just showed are going to be on the worksheet, and there's a notes section for you to use as well. Okay, so we're going to take about 20 minutes, maybe like 18 minutes or so for this step. Any questions before I ask Daita to open the breakout rooms? And I'll be coming around just to see if there's any questions you have. But good luck. made it back from our places in the Zoomiverse. Wonderful. So I hope that was interesting. I heard some really interesting conversations as I popped around the different rooms. A couple things to clarify just as I was going around. So we're just focused on that first page of the worksheet, the activity 1 and steps 1 and 2. So empathize and map. The next breakout we're going to go into is on ideation. Some of you may have already started that with brainstorming solutions. So you're just going to get more time to work on that. The second page of the worksheet we'll do later today. So don't worry about that for now on indicators. Some of you also had some questions on context. So I'm going to, because of the interest in data for this group, I'm going to share with you the full study that this is based on. This is a very long document. So just for the purposes of today, feel free to just use the data set I shared. But for anyone interested in demographics, I think it's on pages 2, 5, and 7. If you want to read about the demographics of the students, you're welcome to use that, just if that's helpful for you to have. But just for our practice today, no need to go too in depth. But if you're curious, I thought I would share it with all of you just to have access to that data. All right, so hopefully that was good. Hopefully we got to a good place with MAP. I'm going to send you back into your groups just after a brief introduction to Ideate. So once we have a good sense of what we think, we've identified some maybe one motivation or barrier. So feel free to just really focus on one for the purposes of today. And what we think needs to change. We can then go into our ideate step, which is creating solution ideas using the levers and strategies. So you could even just take a couple minutes to just brainstorm a huge quantity of ideas, and then narrow them down later. So you could even take a couple minutes, just 2 minutes for everybody to brainstorm ideas related to that thing you identified in MAP of what you need to change, and then have a discussion together about maybe picking one of those ideas that you want to take forward or share with the group. So we're going to do a quick report out after this breakout of what people found. So we're going to take I'm going to give you 10 minutes for this. So feel free to use that same worksheet you were using. And the focus here is going to be the lever that you're going to use and one strategy that uses that lever. So with the example that I had before about salience, we would probably use choice architecture. So moving the bins to a more visible place on campus. So it's a very, very simple example. So thinking about the insights that you read about and the lever and one strategy. Okay, so we'll just keep it mini. Any volunteers? I can also call on somebody, but I know that's a little less fun for you and more fun for me. So
I can go for our group.
okay, thank you.
So we identified space as and knowledge or awareness as being the two kind of barriers, but did feel like the motivation was present, or I should say the belief and attitude were pretty much there. For step 2, we decided to focus on potentially incentive or knowledge, increasing awareness. And then for our ideation, we determined to kind of combined choice architecture and knowledge by having a design competition to create a container that would maximize space and enable people to sort easily between recycling and landfill. And then have signage or informational materials about what goes where. That's part of that programming.
Cool, thanks, Cassie. Can you share again what was the kind of the data point that really led you to thinking about that idea? What were
Yeah,
some-
it was the response to the question of why don't you recycle, what was the barrier, and that, you know, how whatever percentage was said they didn't have enough space to recycle.
Great. So finding kind of a fun way to help students rethink and design that kind of container information. Very cool. Nice story there for where you went. Thank you. Any other groups want to share?
I
I
can
can go.
share it. Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay. I'll go real quick for my group.
Arlene and then
I-
Tina.
We identified some of the same things, just you know, not having space or aware of the opportunities that they have for recycling. So we kind of went off of that one. So we felt that they needed to kind of become more aware of how easy it is and how you don't need a lot of space to do it. So one of the ways that we came up to kind of like address that would be gamifying recycling. So like turning it into a fun challenge. A lot of folks in my group work at schools. So they mentioned things about, you know, kind of like floors or buildings as where like they reside, turning them into teams. And kind of creating recycling challenges and then being rewarded at the end, you know, if it's like a monthly challenge with like a pizza party or some other type of incentive, but also throwing in kind of like some educational knowledge elements by having basically, I think they're called eco reps. So basically like a leader who's kind of tasked with going around and letting people know how they did with recycling and maybe ways that they can improve on the next month's challenge. But yeah, just kind of turning it into a fun game.
Awesome. Thanks, Carling. Appreciate you sharing. Oh, not Carling. Oh, you popped into the square where she was. And now she's gone again. Arlene, thank you. You moved boxes. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's great. Yeah, competitions, I will say one of their big pluses is they often cause like a repetitive behavior. So for habit building, they can be really good at getting students to do that. But yeah, some units do, the competitions can get really intense. I think that is a good point, Victoria. Tina, I think you had your hand raised.
Thought I'd jump in for our group and say we identified the fact that the students, one motivation for them recycling is to save money, and both to save an institution money, and we're talking about an institution where students are on living on a campus, that there are bins for those states that offer the deposits return to have deposit sites or recycling sites where they can get money back for delivering glass, cans and plastic and putting them in machines. This has the benefits of reducing contamination because only the things that are supposed to be recycled are going to go into these bins. The students are motivated by saving money, and it could potentially save the campus the cost of having staff and vehicles going around the campus to collect these materials. I know I'm from New York and you generally do this at a supermarket. So I don't know how feasible this would be to bring this to a college campus, but especially for those students who don't have cars, to be able to bring it from their dorms and save that space that they complained is not really available, and then get a 5 cents deposit per item would, I think, incentivize them.
Yeah, that was an interesting finding in there. And it was, yeah, I think I'm thinking about that was like an interesting ranked question as well, around the savings. But yeah, certain states have that. I remember at Michigan, there were folks who would, after the big football games, would go and collect a lot of cans because you could go and then bring them. So that's great. Thanks for sharing. Anyone else want to report out? I do one more. I'm curious if anyone used a different lever that they haven't heard. I'm curious, did anyone use the social influence lever in their solution? There was that finding about it being the socially responsible thing to do, which I thought was an interesting finding.
I don't know. Taylor and I talked about this a little bit I don't think we got to the concise, you know, boom, 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 like here's what we can share out. We didn't get to that point yet, but we were interested in the finding about, yeah, it being like, you know, students wanting to be environmentally responsible, but also that they were more influenced by their families' attitudes than their peers. And so we were just trying to riff on that. So yeah, maybe like thinking about the emotional appeal of carrying on something that they may have learned before, like enforcing that, you know, whatever behaviors you you know, if you learned about recycling when you were younger, like let's carry that forward. And yeah, so I guess kind of pairing that with either well, some social norming, but the norming, the group would not be their peers, would be their like family attitudes, appealing to that.
Yeah, and I think some of you also made a good point of, because we're some students also might be living at home, for instance, and maybe there's a chance that that's where some of the family influence is coming in, or the friend influence. And I thought that was a higher population or percentage for that question than maybe would be otherwise. So it's, again, another good case of just where the data across campuses can be really different. And I'm sure each of you, if you did this similar survey at your school or institution, it might be a really different response. So very interesting. Jordan, I feel like you had your hand raised briefly. Just wanted to check.
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to piggyback off what Christina had shared, but in kind of the opposite direction. So in our group, we had identified, again, there's a concern and understanding, but as opposed to kind of necessarily sustaining our history, our foundation, our familial piece, looked more so at kind of where we're going. So we're looking at education, we're looking at folks who are getting ready to start their careers. So we focused really on kind of a emotional appeal meets knowledge. So again, kind of we're working on fleshing out exactly what that would look like in application. But just discuss how you might want to consider, you know, collaboratively creating an engagement campaign, potentially a committee to help inform that, so it's very respectful and kind of tapped into that campus culture. But whether your focus in the future might be in clean energy or land and biology or biodiversity, food systems, community resiliency, there's, you know, the list goes on, but really catering a lot of those messages of, you know, taking that belief and that understanding and activating it. While also providing the resources to increase the accessibility of what's available and already there on campus for folks to use.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, thanks for that reflection. That's a good idea. Great. Okay, absolutely last comment from Gioma. Yes.
Yes, that was also the emotional appeal. Developing messaging around that was also a center of our conversation. And one thing that came up when trying to build on, you know, their beliefs and concerns for the environment was being careful about that messaging, because we saw that it could go both ways. On the one hand, we could be crafting messaging that's building on, you know, their the influence, their concern for the environment, and being channeled through platforms of family campus engagement, like through orientations and family weekends and those kind of choice architecture opportunities. So we're talking about that, but we were really discussed a lot about being careful in the way that messaging is pitched, because we also don't want to dial up climate anxiety by calling on the students to save the earth, you know, Mother Earth. And, you know, so we really talked about, on the one hand, being cautious about the messaging, and then on the other hand, also not having a toxic positivity as well, just finding a happy medium where we're leveraging their concern for the environment, but also communicating in a way messages that are meaningful to them and that are actually possible in their context.
Yeah, I love that reflection. I think that's so important. And really also, it reminds me of some of the work around emotions too. And it's like, we have to be so careful when we use things like fear, for instance, just because they can be really powerful in cases where it's, you know, we're trying to prevent like an urgent thing that could happen. But like the emotion of hope is so powerful because of it. It really gives this sense of future looking, particularly when things are hard. But I hear you too on the toxic positivity of like, everything's great, even though like the world's on fire. So yes, it's good to be mindful of that. And I know I only gave you a very small set of data, but I'm sure if you had a lot more data, you could be super thoughtful about figuring out what is that right fit messaging for your audience. So that's great. Yeah, lots of things to be thinking about with this. So thanks to all of you for your work on this. Hopefully it was an interesting exercise just to start thinking about even with limited data, like a lot of different options, a lot of different directions you can go with it. So from here, I wanted to share the next few steps in the process. We're not going to get a chance to actually do them ourselves, but just where do you go from here? And then we'll take our second break before we have our last section of this time together. So the next 3 steps after we've developed a solution. So think of the solution that you came up with in your group. You would then move on to the prototype step. And this is where you would create a small scale draft of your solution that you would then test with, for instance, in this case, if we're working with students, we might test with students in some way. So we might create a focus group or send even a survey to a subset of students or immerse them in some sort of experience. Maybe we'd set up a new bin station and see how easy it is to use. So creating some sort of prototype, so the actual material or the actual experience. So thinking about what that might look like. And then that's really connected to test, which is where we actually get the feedback from students in this case about the solution that we've come up with. So starting to just see, was this effective? So for instance, for the group that thinking of the first one around designing that, the kind of design your new bin. You might bring in a couple students and give them those instructions and kind of see how it goes, or get some ideas about, oh, what else could we incorporate into this? See how they react to it. Do they love that activity? Are they a little bit skeptical? What do they think about it? And then make revisions so that the prototype and test is particularly loopy in this framework, because we often see that can be an area where you spend some time coming up with an idea, testing it, getting some feedback, maybe trying something else. And I think all the ideas you came up with are a great example of, there's a lot of different things that you might come up with based on the data that you have. And this is a great chance to really see which ones stick and which ones seem to gain traction before you move on to this launch step. Here's the test overview of what I was mentioning around presenting that solution in a lot of different ways, getting feedback in a real world setting, super important here. Trying to think about representation in your test group. So trying to have, a lot of different student perspectives in the room when you share your solution. And consulting with, we think about this particularly when we're working with communities as well, just having those key informants. I think all of you are pretty much embedded in the environments in which you work, but if you were ever going somewhere new, having that key person on the ground is really, really helpful. And then so once you've got a solution that you're feeling really confident about, moving it into the launch step. So this is where you really are planning and implementing your solution at scale. This also can involve a bit of assessment. So you want to be thinking about, and we'll talk about assessment in our last piece of today, but assessment being something where we're thinking about really throughout the whole behavior-centered design journey, but definitely in launch, having a sense of how are you going to actually measure what you implement, and just a lot of details. So just where, when, how, who is involved in this implementation. And having local experts. I think having students in this case be involved in something like this would be really helpful. If you're doing any sort of any experiment, thinking about just the fairness of the different conditions in that experiment. But for many of you, it may just be putting together that launch plan, having some measurement on either side, which we'll talk about next. So let's take another just 2 minutes here. If you need another movement break, you need a bio break or some water, we'll start again. We'll start at like 13 or 14 after the hour, and do our last section together. I was also reminded for anyone else who's in the Eastern time zones that the sun is already setting. So it's just a reminder of this changing season. But hope you had a good stretch if you did that, or got some water or some food during that time. So we're going to do our last section together. So we're in the home stretch, the final bit of our time. And I wanted to really save some time for us to talk about assessment and evaluation. I think for some of you, that was an important component of what you hope to learn today. So I wanted to make sure we spend some time on that. And so we're going to talk about the assess step, which is here as our step number 8. We're really measuring the effectiveness and impact of our solution. So while assess does come at the end, technically, of this behavior-centered design journey, it really is something that we want to be thinking about throughout the process, and something that you'll hopefully spend a lot of time on if you kind of are really doing this in full, that it'll be a continual question as you go through each of the steps. So there's a lot of different types of assessment that we can do, different options here, which I'll go into more detail in the coming slides. So assessment is also, it really is about measurement, but it's also about just reflecting what worked, what didn't work. This is very much a chance for learning within particularly your program team. If you're working, say in an office that's doing this kind of work, talking with students about what's working. It's also really great to, if you do run a behavior change campaign, or you implement a program like this, reporting on the outcomes is a great way just for others to learn about what you did, and also continuing to monitor the effects of that particular solution. So sometimes we'll implement something and then we'll say, okay, we did it. And it's great to just keep an eye on how that continues to change, particularly as new students come on campus, or there are changes, or a global pandemic hits, or anything else that might have a huge impact on what we implemented. So a lot of different things to consider here. Breaking this down more into kind of the ingredients for program evaluation. So different things that we are looking for in evaluating. So our goals and objectives. So what are the outcomes that we want to achieve? So this is hopefully something that you've also identified as early as the frame step, but a good time to check in again and assess of what are you hoping to learn? What are you hoping to achieve through this behavior change process? Identifying your program logic. So thinking about your hypothesis or your theory of change, which I'll describe more about in a minute, but how do you plan to achieve those objectives? What is that sequence of activities that are going to be a part of the program that's going to lead to behavior change? And why do you think that's going to work? Your indicators. So this is really, how do you know you achieved your objectives? So it might be the behavior, or the beliefs or attitudes, knowledge. How are you going to track those changes along the way to behavior? Your evaluation approach. So what is the actual measurement strategy that you have, whether it's a survey or an experiment? So what are you going to use to actually determine those changes and indicators? And then monitoring, as I mentioned. So your process to really see change over time. So there's a lot of different components of assessment here that are really helpful in understanding that overall change. So I wanted to just put up on the slide a graph of some different evaluation approaches. So I'll start kind of in the bottom right here. So we have qualitative and quantitative on the y-axis, and kind of rigor on the x-axis. And randomized controlled trials are kind of the gold standard, particularly in behavioral science studies and evaluations. These can take a lot of time and energy and resources and expertise to put together. So while they are really useful for us being able to determine that the solution you put in place is the sole reason that we can, that is what we can account for in terms of the behavior changing, and there's no other variables. For many organizations, that is not the most feasible option for evaluation. So we put some others on here as well in terms of pre-post tests or focus groups, surveys. There are a lot of different ways that we can gather data about how our behavior change solution went, how successful it was. Less rigorous does not mean less useful. So even if you're doing surveys, it doesn't mean that you can't trust the data. It means that there are just some more considerations about what interpreting that data means. But just knowing that there are a lot of different options that you have when it comes to trying to really take measurements of what's going on. So related to this, I want to spend a bit of time talking about theories of change, as I think this is a great way for us to bring everything together about thinking through program design and program logic and how that works. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this concept of theories of change, and it's really this directional flow diagram that illustrates the relationship between program activities, those maybe behaviors, and those ultimate outcomes. And this is, of course, it's really helpful to have these logic models or structures in place. And we can also have some assumptions baked in about why some of that success is happening. So if you say run a competition or something on your campus and you see a change, you might go, great, that's great. But it's not always clear why that competition led to the behavior change. And so I'm going to offer a slightly another type of theory of change, which we call a psychosocial theory of change. And this means that we are actually measuring the relationship between the activities, the psychosocial states, and then the behaviors. So this really gives us a lot more information about why certain activities that we did, like a competition or a messaging campaign or putting new flyers up or new signage, why did that lead to behavior change and the outcomes that we're ultimately interested in? And it just gives us more information. It tells us more about why a program is working. It also allows us to adaptively manage the program as it's in progress. And I'll talk more about that as we go, but this gives us just a lot of opportunities to be really strategic in our work. So here is a bit more about what this looks like for the psychosocial theory of change. So you've got different rows in terms of the layers of the theory of change, and then time moving from left to right. And so at the bottom, we just label those enabling conditions. So anything that we think needs to be in place. So for instance, if we're trying to enable recycling, we need to make sure that it would be really helpful to know that the town, for instance, that the university is in actually has access to recycling. If not, it's going to be a really, really big barrier, even if we get a bunch of students to recycle. So just setting out some of those conditions can be really helpful. Then activities and materials. So these are those tactics, strategies that lead to the psychosocial states. So those are knowledge, beliefs, feelings that are going to get people to adopt those behavioral milestones, and then ultimately the outcomes. So we've got all of these different pieces of the theory of change different parts that are labeled and move in sequence to help us really capture the logic of what we're doing. So I just wanted to also show on the left side here that these parts of the theory of change are really tied to the behavior-centered design process. So those outcomes and behaviors we're really determining in the frame step. And then the psychosocial states are a lot of what you were uncovering with the barriers and motivations is what we're doing in empathize and map. And then the activities and materials are what we're brainstorming in ideate. And so even though we might read the theory of change from left to right, we actually build it in the opposite, or I guess in terms of time, it's always going to be left to right. But as I introduced it kind of bottom up, the way we actually build this theory of change is from top to bottom. So we start with those outcomes and behaviors, we then identify the states, then we identify the activities. And I think that's also a really important difference with this theory of change, is that we don't start with designing the activities. This also reminds me a lot of designing of learning objectives and curricula in the classroom, and that we start with what are our learning objectives, and then we actually design the activities in the classroom after we know what those objectives are. So a lot of similarities here in terms of really starting with those goals and those states, like what do we want people to learn, what do we want people to feel or know or believe, and then we design the activities last. So I'm going to give you a very high level simplistic example of what this could look like. So this is one around plastic waste. So we might have the enabling condition around, I think this particular example was trying to get people to bring a reusable bag when shopping, and the environmental problem around plastic bag waste in oceans and rivers, so kind of marine plastic. And so through this process, I might have identified that two really key beliefs that I needed to change were around people feeling like there's a benefit to them of using a reusable bag that's really tangible, and also that they see this social norm of other people using reusable bags. So that it becomes more commonplace when they go to the store, that it just becomes that habit and that norm that that's the thing you do. So I might identify those are the states, and then I might, within a store, I might come up with an activity of, I'm going to create actually a special discount line for people who shop with a reusable bag, because I really want to create this feeling of benefit. And then once more people have that benefit, then more people are going to bring their bags, which is going to lead to that behavior. So again, this is a really high level, pretty simple example, but just to show the relationship between those different parts of the theory of change, where if I had just drawn a line between the discount line and people using the reusable bags, I wouldn't really know what I had done. What about the line was helping me actually create that change? And because I've identified these states in the middle, it helps me also design more tailored activities. So just like you did in the map step in our case study, you were able to use those states and those barriers and motivations to actually design activities that were going to be most impactful for creating the behavior you're interested in. So this is a really helpful way for us to think about that. Once we have our theory of change, we also can develop indicators. So within those different states that I mentioned, we also want to figure out how do we actually measure the change in those different things. So how do we measure the behaviors or those states that are changing throughout? So I've put up some different types of indicators here in terms of the behavioral one is pretty straightforward in terms of just the change in behavior. We've also got social indicators, so social structures or patterns or context to measure. We've got those psychological indicators. So what are the changes in beliefs that we can measure? And then the environmental ones. So, so if I'm interested in reducing plastic waste in the oceans, maybe I really need to look at, the tons of plastic that wash up on the beach, or what is the way that I can actually tell that there's a decrease of plastic in the water? And then the ways of measuring them. So for each of the indicators, we might have direct ways. So this is going to be really like seeing the behavior in action, for instance. So like seeing the number of students that recycle. We might more often, we have what's called a proxy indicator, which means that there's something that represents the behavior. A really clear example of this for me is energy reports. So oftentimes we can't see people literally using energy in their homes, but an energy report gives us a really, really good representation of how much energy people are using. And similarly, if we're trying to reduce plastic bag use, we might be able to use the procurement records of, oh, how many more bags did you buy this month? Oh, it seems like there's a reduction in the amount of bags that are needed. So there are sometimes those proxy indicators can be really helpful. And then there are some things like psychological indicators that we have to get through self-report. So we have to just rely on people telling us how their beliefs have changed or how their attitudes have changed, which of course have some bias inherent to them, but we don't really have access to that information otherwise. So there are some ways that we just do have to measure them in that way. So just some different notes on indicators. And I'll give you some examples of what this looks like. So in my example from the theory of change, I talked about people shopping with reusable bags. That was my behavioral indicator, and measured by, I might measure the number of people using the dedicated line. That might be my proxy indicator, or the number of plastic bags used before or after to see if there's a decrease. For psychological indicators, I might be looking at the percent of people who believe that using a reusable bag is beneficial to them. I might implement, I might ask cashiers to ask questions during checkout, or send a one-question survey. So that might be one way I do that. For social indicators, I might be trying to track the conversations happening about reusable bags. I might do a survey, or I might do observation, or have someone try to listen in on an average week about whether that's something people are talking about. And then environmental. I might be looking at, tons of plastic in a nearby ocean or river. I might do beach observations or monthly cleanups as a way of measuring that. So let's practice just identifying these different indicators in a quick kind of comprehension check here. So I'm going to share a few questions, and you're going to have the same options each time. So which could be a good psychological indicator for the behavior of using less water? You can select all that apply. It's a little bit of a hint. So feel free to share the letter in the chat of what you think this is. Great, I'm seeing A, I'm seeing C, some Bs. Okay, great. So yes, this one is going to be A and C in this case. So this is where we're really measuring the amount of people who know how much water their household uses. That's going to be like that knowledge indicator, some of those psychosocial states, and then also the amount of people who believe that water reduction is important. So those are two maybe psychological indicators that we could measure. And there are different ways that we could measure those. All right, let's try another one. So which of the following same options could be a good environmental indicator for the behavior of using less water? Okay, I'm seeing some B, D happening, a few A's. More D's. A and B. Okay, so this one I'm gonna put out as being D, because we're really interested in the this environmental outcome of kind of water reduction. So we're going to be focused on the amount of water available in the local aquifer reservoir. So that's going to be more of our focus here for the environmental indicator, that we hope that by people using less water, that it leads to more water available. So that would be our environmental indicator. So how about this last one? So the behavioral indicator of using less water. Good point about water. Yes, water availability. Also, how much it rains. Good point. Yes, there are lots of different variables. Yes, lots of B's here. So kind of gave it away by this being the last one we haven't used yet. But this one is going to be the most straightforward, is it's if we're interested in people using less water, that is likely also to be our behavioral indicator of what we are focused on. There are also some times where you have smaller micro behaviors that you might be focused on that then lead to a larger target behavior. So if you have a behavior that involves multiple steps, for instance, you may have several behavioral indicators that lead to a more ultimate target behavior. But in this case, we have those. Great. Any questions about indicators or the theory of change as I mentioned it so far?
Can I ask Katie,
Sure.
for the, just not about the change structure, but what's an example of a micro behavior?
Sure. So let's see, one might be, so one of the behaviors we look at RARE is, let's see, I will use like installing solar in your home, for instance. So if the target behavior is like getting solar panels on your roof, one of the micro behaviors might be doing a solar assessment at your home. So like calling and actually having someone come to your home, like setting up an assessment, or it might be researching options for getting that solar assessment. So there are certain behaviors that just have certain pretty significant steps involved. I've seen other good examples with like riding a bike. So like having to like purchase a bike or talking to people about a bike. So there might be some other significant steps that you identify that lead to that ultimate behavior. Does that help a bit?
Yeah, it does. Thanks. That's great.
Absolutely. Okay, great. So I'm going to give you one more activity, which hopefully will continue to solidify some of the things that we've been talking about. And that's going to be, I'm going to take us back to our Iowa recycling study. And we're going to create a very, very simple psychosocial theory of change. So what I've done here is I identified your behavioral milestone or your behavioral state here, which is going to be students recycling, and our outcome, so reducing waste going to landfill. And in your group, you're going to be identifying one of those psychosocial states, which is going to be hopefully very related to what you came up with in the kind of empathize and map steps, and then one activity. So I just want us to practice kind of creating this logic chain of the activity leads to the state, leads to the behavior, leads to the outcome. So I'm going to, so here are your steps. So you're going to go to the second page of that same worksheet that you were using. So if you just scroll down, you'll see this activity. So it's going to be breakout activity number 2. And you're going to get through as much of this as you can. We're only going to have probably about 8 minutes for this, so it's going to be pretty quick. But try to just fill in one state in those rows. And then if you have time, start talking a bit about the indicators. So thinking about how would you measure the state that you put in there, and you don't need to measure the activity, but thinking about how might you measure that state. Maybe you could talk about measuring the behavior as well. Okay. All right, I'm going to take about 8 minutes here. And yeah, do as much as you can with this time, but hopefully a good chance to just practice this framework. So if there aren't any questions, we will send you off. Okay, great. Daita, is it okay if we open the rooms?
One moment.
No problem. Some really good conversations though on measurement. And yeah, I was going to take one volunteer for anyone who wanted to tell us kind of their logic chain, their very simple psychosocial theory of change. Anyone want to volunteer that and share it with the group? I know there's some good ones out there, so. Oh man, so shy.
I
I'm
can
gonna,
go. I can go. Yeah, it's me. It's Karen. So for our group, our activity was, so we'd been the group that suggested you installing machines that where students could take their recyclables and get a deposit return for them. So that was the activity, a psychosocial state. We wanted to not just keep it at, desire for money. Like we wanted to wanted to go beyond the monetary benefit to recycling. So we wanted to give them a sense of hope. We kind of struggled with how to identify that psychosocial state. But the behavior was measured by the amount of students recycling, like the amount that was produced, recycling produced, and then the amount of money dispensed. But for a social environmental outcome, we thought maybe the machine could also indicate have like a ticker tape thing on the front saying how much plastic was removed from the environment or how much CO2, or maybe, eventually the kinds of items, show images of the kinds of items that were made from the plastics recovered through the machine as a kind of like, this is what your actions did, giving them some kind of positive feedback. So yeah, that was what we said.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, it sounds like you've got some almost other messaging things built in there that might be motivating to students to be able to see the impacts of their actions. So that's great. Awesome. Thanks for sharing. I'll maybe see if we can, I'm now thinking if I could create some sort of Google Doc where we could all share out, just because we don't have time to share them all today. But if people are interested in being able to hear what other people came up with, maybe put a note in the chat and maybe I can put together some sort of shared space where we can do that. So just to kind of wrap up, we're moving in towards the closing of our workshop today. So just some key points to remember on this psychosocial theory of change. This helps us design a more targeted program with activities that address our actors' motivations and barriers, so we can really tell that clear story. It helps us track key indicators and also test and validate assumptions and program logic. So once we have a theory of change, it can be something we tell ourselves that story, and if it goes, that doesn't really make any sense, we can continue to work on it. Or as we're implementing it, if we find that certain parts of the theory of change don't work, we can actually just go focus on fixing those pieces rather than overhauling the entire program. So it allows us to be to also just to adapt more flexibly as we implement something. Okay, so I know we covered a lot today. Thank you so much for your engagement and digging into all of these questions. I'm going to do a brief virtual reflection as we wind down towards closing. So I'd love if you could share in the chat, what's a word or phrase that describes today's sessions? So you can drop those in the chat. Engaging, comprehensive, intensive, puzzling, applicable, formative, productive, mind expanding. Ooh. Poignant, fascinating. Great. Full of ideas. Norms that can be measured. Thought-provoking. Applicable and supportive. Useful. Great. Practical. Wonderful. That's great to hear. It's also okay if you've still got a lot of questions. I know there's a lot more to dig in here, but I'm really glad that it sounds like there's yeah, a lot of good feelings in the space. My second question is, what is something you're excited to apply in your own work? So it could be a concept you learned today, or a framework, or something you heard from somebody else. Something you're excited to apply. Share that in the chat. Levers, great. Or discipline and structure around planning and evaluation, assessment. Whole framework, that's great. Structure of these exercises. Indicators. Full BCD journey, awesome. Impact assessment, exercises. Yeah, just the value of having students go through this. Yeah, students are also just, as you all know, just so incredibly creative. So it's really fun doing this kind of work with them and what they come up with. Oh yeah, choice architecture, problem behavior maps. Yeah, those are a great starting point. Yeah, thanks for sharing these. Doing a case study. Yeah, frameworks. Wonderful. These are great. Yeah, thanks again for sharing those. And I hope you'll keep me posted as you continue to use this work. I wanted to share just a few resources with you all of kind of where to go from here. So I will, that's where I will be dropping a lot of links in the chat for you, and then also share these with Daita to share with you afterwards. RARE has a website called behavior.rare.org. This is our Center for Behavior in the Environment hub, like virtual platform. So this is where you can find all of our tools. You can learn more about our trainings here as well. This is a membership site. It's completely free to join, but some resources you may find are kind of behind a membership wall, so to speak, but it just requires you to log in for free. But this website has a lot of different resources on it, so we encourage you to check it out if you would like to dig in more to what you learned today. We also have we have other trainings that we offer. So this was a 3-hour module. We also do a 3-day training on behavior-centered design. We also have an introduction to behavior-centered design, which is a fully online e-learning course, which I think was offered on the ASHE page. And there's a discount for nonprofits and those in academic institutions. There also are fee waivers for those who find the cost inaccessible at this time. And there's a form to fill out for that. You can also contact me directly if you have any concerns about it. We also do offer these student-based design challenges, which are really fun. So if you think that's something that you'd be interested in offering, definitely let's chat. That would be, these are really great opportunities. We also do custom training. So if you think there's something for your staff or students that would be interesting, also feel free to reach out. But I'll drop that link about just our other trainings in the chat as well, if you want to read more about them. Finally, we also have a newsletter. So if you're interested in just reading about some of the things we're working on at the intersection of behavior and the environment, or what's in the news, we try to share each month new articles at this intersection and things that are happening in this space. So feel free to subscribe with us. Just all of the links in the chat today. Also, please share your feedback. So yeah, Daita just dropped in the chat. This is an ASHE survey just about the workshop. This will also be something that I will use to continue to revise this workshop and build on what you really liked. So please do take a moment to fill that out. It's really helpful for us. and really appreciate it. And all of your thoughts there. Finally, just wanted to put my contact information on the page. And I hope you'll stay in touch. Feel free to reach out to us. And it's been a real pleasure getting to work with you all today. And I wish you the best of luck with your sustainability challenges. I know that can be a lot of work. And yeah, motivating students and the many communities in academia. So thank you for all that you're doing and for your time today. And I'll stay on for a couple minutes if anybody wants to chat. But yeah, just a huge thank you to all of you. It's been a really fun way to spend the afternoon, or at least my afternoon. So appreciate it.
Thank you, Katie, and everyone for attending. I'll drop in the links again for our upcoming workshops and the award ceremony, and I hope to see you again at one of these events. Thanks.